Hello, my name is Clarence Istepa, and welcome to my research proposal, Restoring Radioactive Rivers Research into the Fukushima Watershed. This title could have been renamed, probably something boring like ways to induce mass erosion in an attempt to discharge radioactive elements from river systems. But I like alliteration, so I went with this one instead. So before I continue with explaining my proposal, I would recommend, if you haven't already, reading over the documented report that I am basing this off of. I have made a Word document or a PDF that explains everything in much greater detail than I can explain here in words. During the 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster, there was a radioactive plume that covered roughly around 30 kilometers area northwest of the nuclear facility. This cloud of radioactive elements contaminated many of the river systems and the terrain of the Fukushima prefecture. Most of the radiation from this event specifically, the cloud, the plume of radioactive element, came in the form of radiocesium. I'm assuming that's how it's pronounced. And infiltrated into the soil-water environment. While this portion of radiation is comparatively much smaller than the radiation found on site from the nuclear facility, it is one that covered a much wider area and one that lingers on much longer. The radiocesium found predominantly in the river sediment has been observed to exit the watershed system with the gradual erosion of the sediment that the contaminant is attached to. Because of this, events such as storms, typhoons, snowmelt, any dynamic flooding events in the system have been observed to accelerate the rate of discharging this contaminant. To put it simply, to get rid of the radioactive element, it's easiest to just get rid of the sediment it is attached to. The goal of a project such as this would be to determine a river management plan of action most suitable for controlling the transfer of radioactive elements through a river system. Due to the rapid flowing and intermittent nature of rivers, a clearly established set of viable projects to expel or withhold contaminated sediment in the stream would greatly improve the speed in which the effects of future nuclear failures could be mitigated more rapidly. The literature related to this subject come from primarily 4 independent sources that I found, each of which addressed the very explicit element of radiocesium-137, which was stated to have a half-life of 30 years and is most commonly found in the sediment of the river. Each paper also mentions the significance of erosive action in lowering the levels of radioactive contaminants in the river system. This graph here found in one of the papers shows that by 1 year after the nuclear failure, majority of the radioactive contamination found by the plume had dissipated. However, a significant level of radiation still remained and declined at a much reduced rate even 5 years after. Due to the lengthy half-life of radiocesium, most of this change can be attributed to the physical erosion of the terrain rather than natural decay. So there is little mystery to the effects of erosion on reducing radioactive contamination. The process is clear. To remove radiocesium, you have to remove the silt and clay that it is attached to. So the objective of a study like this would be to establish a plan of actions to expedite the rate of sediment erosion in a river, while either maintaining its profile or recovering its profile after a target level of radiation and sediment has been removed from the system. Without taking into consideration the ecological aspects of changing a river's profile, this project would look only to the extent of the channel form and riparian area in its goal of restoration or maintenance. Accomplishing this goal would have significant impacts on recovering from potential nuclear disasters in the future. Local action could be taken with minimal intervention tactics, which will remove radioactive contaminants from the immediate ecosystem faster than the half-life would have otherwise done over the 30-year half-life period. The methodology of this project is pretty crude, predominantly for one reason. I am not a master of radioactive elements. I'm not a chemist or a physicist. I like rivers. There's quite a big gap of knowledge. So I'm making the assumption that soil samples can be taken and their level of radiation can be determined using some sort of specialized radioactive instrument. Regardless of whether or not that is true, because of the high correlation of soil to radiation in this system, a general estimation of success in expelling radiation could be measured by the equivalent expelling of sediment, as the two are very highly correlated. For consistent monitoring, soil samples will be collected over established locations on a monthly interval over the span of 5 years. Though 5 years is a relatively short and arbitrary number, it is much shorter than the 30-year half-life of radiocesium, and any significant changes should only scale from there onward. Because erosion occurs to a much higher degree during high precipitation events, it could be concluded that inducing similar events could have similar outcomes. To artificially impose this kind of hydraulic stress, the withholding and then sudden release of dam water would likely be the most effective way to imitate similar criteria to that of a natural flood. Assuming there are not already dams in the area that can be used for these purposes, smaller scale dams can be made, not associated with energy generation, their only purpose being the controlling of water levels. To determine what flooding event could be safe to incite, a HEC-RES model could be created of the river using public elevation data and a discharge rate equal to that of what a small dam can support. After executing a flood event by this method, sediment transport can be measured, and after each flood event, satellite imagery could be taken to see if the channel meandering is significant enough to consider for maintenance and or profile restoration. To justify the existence of a study such as this, future radioactive failures that contaminate areas with active rivers could be restored faster. This would support the ecology of those river systems along with the economic and humanitarian implications that they will have. This would all be accomplished with optimal cost of resources spent constructing semi-permanent dam structures designed for periods less than 30 years relative to the half-life of radiocesium. Future implications of this project might look into alternative methods of inducing mass erosion events, with or without the use of dam structures. This technique could be used to terraform rivers regardless of their radioactive contamination. This methodology would be useful to the greater scientific community, as well as city planners or fields related to hydrology and land use. Ultimately, actions of this scale would reach at the very least the municipal bodies of government for approval or oversight. Structuring this knowledge for use would likely take the form of what simulated dams were modeled and what the measured effects of erosions were observed using those models. That concludes all the information I have to present here. Again, I recommend that you look over the report document that I prepared as it goes into greater detail, and thank you for listening to my presentation.